Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ali Dad Mafi Nezam. I am Policy Director at the American-Iranian Council. I am delighted to welcome you all to this special policy roundtable that AIC has organized to see what it is that we can all accomplish together. First of all, to see how we can work together to promote strategic thinking in U.S.-Iranian relations in Washington and around the world, to explore why this relationship is so important to regional and international peace and security, and also beyond that collaboration that we seek in developing and articulating strategic thinking in U.S.-Iran relations, we wish to explore how people in this room can raise the level of engagement between the U.S. and Iran. As you know, the two countries, through the leadership of people like Bob Einhorn and indeed the eminent individuals who are here today, have concluded a series of successful nuclear negotiations in Europe. At the same time, in Washington, as you might note in the materials before you, we have yet to see, we have yet to witness a strategic articulation of why the United States finds this relationship important and where America can lead. The whole notion of American leadership is, of course, of critical importance in this debate. We are really delighted to have men and women around this table today, every one of whom have made significant contributions to the policy debate in this city. And that's why we are going to begin today with some brief preliminary remarks. I would like to ask our lead discussants to keep their remarks anywhere between 5 to 7 minutes, if possible. Once those remarks are uttered, we're going to have lunch, and then we're going to have a private discussion of what it is that we can all accomplish together. I'm especially delighted to be in the company of Senator Bennett Johnston, a leader in every sense of the word, a man who was in the United States Senate for over 2 decades and who retired in '97 and who is now involved in various types of internationally significant work in this city. We are honored to have Professor Amir Ahmadi with us as well, who is the founder and president of the American-Iranian Council, and indeed everybody else whose names you see in the material before you. So without further ado, I would like to call on Senator Johnston to start our meeting officially today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here with this distinguished crowd. One of my favorite Washington stories has to do with Oliver Wendell Holmes, which you all will remember served longer as Justice of the United, or at least later in age as Justice of the Supreme Court than any man in history. And when he was in his 90s, he went to catch the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad over here at the train station. Got on the train, and after a while, the ticket taker came around and greeted Mr. Holmes and said, "Mr. Justice Holmes, we're delighted to have you, and now if you would give me your ticket, I'd be glad to have it." Mr. Justice Holmes looked in his left pocket, his right pocket, his shirt pocket, his pant pocket. The ticket was nowhere to be found. Obviously, he was very embarrassed. The ticket taker said, "Mr. Justice Holmes, don't worry about the ticket." He said, "We're just delighted to have you on this train." Mr. Justice Holmes looked at the young man and said, "Young man, you don't seem to understand. The problem is not where is my ticket. The problem is where am I going?" So, in my 8 years as chairman of the American-Iranian Conference, it has been a very, very interesting journey. Starting in 2006, when a Rutgers professor named Amir Ahmadi called me. I had just returned from a trip to Iran with a company, and wanted me to come and speak to the American-Iranian Conference, and that led to my chairmanship. I'm not nearly as active as a chairman as Hu Shang is as a president, and certainly not as knowledgeable. But I have learned a lot from Hu Shang in those intervening years. The only problem is that a 2-hour lunch, which we have from time to time, is not nearly enough time to download all the information that Hu Shang has about Iran, which he visits, as I think most of you know very frequently. Let me state what I see as the role of the American-Iranian Council. It is not to be an apologist for Iran, nor for that matter for some of the sins of the United States in Iran. Rather, it is, in my view, to be a source of information. Hu Shang is one of the best informed people, if not the best person in the United States on American-Iranian affairs, or certainly Iranian affairs. As you know, he visits there frequently. He ran for president this last time. He tells the story about how the Iranian CIA came by his hotel room and informed him that it was not appropriate for him to run. He said, look, I understand the Guardian Council is not going to let me run. They said, no, that's not the problem. We don't want you as popular as you are to get your name out there. It would be very disrupting to Iranian politics. He took the hint, of course, and did not run. But Hu Shang is a real resource for the AIC. He is trusted in Iran. He is trusted in the United States. And that is a very tricky thing to be trusted on both sides of that bridge. I think the AIC offers an excellent bridge to the new Iran, which we hope will exist, an Iran that will join the community of nations. It is, of course, a tremendously exciting place, so rich in resources, both human and natural. And of course, now we're engaged in that very vital negotiation. In my view, clearly the right thing to do. Whether it will be successful or not, no one knows, but it is clearly the right thing to do. And in my view, the interim deal was very much in the interest of the United States and in the West. We achieved certainly a standstill and a backup to a large extent in Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon. The alternative to a negotiation has been called a strike. I'd like to just give my view of what a strike would mean. A strike would not mean a few bombers going over and taking out a few facilities. I understand there's something like 60 different sites in Iran that have nuclear material. It would take dozens and dozens, or probably hundreds, of sorties of airplanes over a period of weeks to attempt to degrade Iran's nuclear facilities. It is, as with all wars, would be totally unpredictable as to what would happen. Secretary Gates says that there's a high likelihood that an American ship would be sunk. And, you know, you should sink an American ship and the atmosphere changes greatly. While people say we don't want boots on the ground, what happens when you sink an American ship and when American boys get killed? So it would be a very, very unpredictable and, in my view, difficult thing and is not a very good alternative to negotiation. The result is likely to be to unite the Iranian people behind the Ayatollah, and we could not eliminate the knowledge of Iranians as to their nuclear program, which would mean that eventually they would be back on the road toward a nuclear weapons. The result of a successful negotiation, in my view, would be world-changing and would be very good for the United States, provided that Iran would really join the community of nations and be, if not our ally, at least our partner in various things around the world. Not all countries would view with favor Iran coming back with 2 million barrels a day of oil. I'm sure the Saudis would not be anxious to see that happen. But in my view, for the United States, it would be a very good thing indeed. And if Iran joins the community of nations, the American-Iranian Conference will be in a very excellent position to be as a bridge for American businesses, for American government, for political system to be able to interface with the Iranians. I hope that that happens and that we will be able to send Hushang back, and maybe next time they will allow him to run for president. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Johnston. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Amir Ahmadi to share his vision with us.
Good afternoon. It's just about afternoon. I wanted to thank you all for coming. It's an honor to have you all here. This group is well selected, and they are in many ways the real people in the U.S.-Iran relations, in policy and activism side. Senator, thank you. You have been an inspiration for me, actually. You have been very kind to me always, and you have been always there as a supporter for me and the organization. You have served that organization and the U.S.-Iran relations very well, and we are honored to have you as our chairman. I wanted to take also this opportunity to thank Alidad for putting this event together, a very strategic event. Thank you, Alidad. This is really his show in many ways. I also wanted to thank Alidad's sort of colleagues. Sitting next to him is Ahmad and Kaywan and Ehsan, and we have one or two absent, unfortunately, but I'm very grateful to all of them, because AIC without them is nothing. We have gathered here, as Alidad said, to impress upon the policymakers in the U.S. and in Iran that there is a serious need for strategic thinking in U.S.-Iran relations. Even if over the years the need for strategic thinking has increased in U.S.-Iran relations, its role in U.S.-Iran policy has indeed diminished. I believe we had more strategic thinking during for example, President Bill Clinton's time than we have now under President Obama. We still need to hear President Obama's administration to make a few statements, Iran policy statement or a roadmap. None exists. I have never heard any administration policy people to speak on this so openly as, like, for example, Madeleine Albright did. The same goes with Iran. That is, in Iran's side also, there was more strategic thinking when President Rafsanjani was in place than it is today with President Rouhani, who is again focused on nitty-gritty stuffs. Indeed, the significance of strategic thinking has particularly increased because, as I would say, that strategic thinking will involve you with the leadership in Iran, while tactical moves will just keep you busy with the government. Most of us don't recognize that Iran has two levels of policy: strategic with the leadership, and the nizam, that is the system, where the revolution stands and all kinds of other things, and of course the government, where the cabinet members are busy with daily economic matters and some other less strategic matters. Now, the word strategic thinking sounds like a cliche. It has been so many times repeated, talked about, but then unfortunately it never had been put on the table as a matter of a policy guidance. That is to say, strategic thinking, even if it was discussed in this country, it didn't have policy consequence. The strategic thinking, of course, must have policy consequences. Otherwise, it is not strategic thinking to begin with. We don't think strategically just because we like it. In the specific case of U.S.-Iran relations, okay, strategic thinking, for example, would involve, just give you a few examples, an evaluation, and a candid and honest evaluation of the current state of U.S.-Iran relations, including the achievements of the policies in place or have been in place for a long time, like the dual containment or now the dual track policy of coercive diplomacy and all kinds of stuff. Has American sanctions, for example, and isolation policy benefited the U.S.? Yes, it has harmed the Islamic Republic, but has it benefited the United States of America? You can harm others, but can you benefit from? That's number one. Second, is the United States better off today in the region, in its economic side, and every other stuff, influence, regional influence, better off today than it was, let's say, 30 years ago? Is American economic penetration in the region, it has been more successful in the last 30 years than before? My answer to these questions are all no. The region is more unstable. U.S. is less integrated economically in the region. Its regional influence has declined, and that certainly it is not better off in many other respects. Again, of course, there are other issues that have impacted this unfortunate situation for the United States in the region, but relation with the U.S. and lack of strategic thinking has been one of those issues. Another issue, we need a candid evaluation of the assumptions that underlie the policy in this country. For example, assumptions about Iran's domestic scene. We will talk about it in a second. Iran's Islamic regime and where it is going, about Iran's economic and strategic potentials and significance, or Iran's strengths in the region and its implications. Some of the key concerns that U.S. has on the policy sides or issue sides, and of course the future trajectory of Iran. Let me just give you a few examples because we don't have really much time, so I could quickly go through it for you. One major assumption, one major point where the United States government policy is based is that it never really looked at Iran, the regime, as having a two-level policy sort of people. In Iran, when you talk about the regime, you are talking about the revolution and the nizam led by Mr. Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basijis, the Imam, the Friday prayers, you're talking about the mosques, you're talking about, God knows what. And then you have also at the cabinet side, the executive branch, where there's a completely different game is played. Most of us forget that the Islamic Republic, over the last 34 years, except for the 8 years of so-called Ahmadinejad radicalism, has always been run by the moderates and reformists. That's right. So if Rouhani has come on board, no surprise. We had Khatami, we had Rafsanjani, we had before him Khamenei himself, a very, very pragmatic and open-minded person before he becomes the leader. What I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, the American policy is an election policy, election-based policy. In Iran, if there is an election where Khamenei, when Rouhani is elected, the game changes versus Ahmadinejad. And yet they don't recognize that this level of change is irrelevant, really, to US-Iran problems. What is relevant is that strategic nizam and system side. And how can we make that part of the system to work with us? We often misunderstand Iran in terms of an Islamic republic as if everybody in the country is Islamic, the Iranians are a bunch of fanatics, or the people are so pro-regime that nothing else exists there. So therefore, Mr. Obama will say, now Rouhani's election, we say that openly, shows that Iranian people have had a great election and that this was democratic and everything. There is some changes there. Well, Iranians believe in election. That's different from taking that belief in election to extend it into accepting something that the regime is doing. That's two different issues. Mr. Obama, people of Iran do believe in elections and they wanted to go through elections no matter what. So take that into account when you make your statements. Next, the issue of the relation between sanctions, isolation, and democracy. Let's give me another example. We have over time assumed that the more sanctions and the more isolation will create more democracy and human rights in Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, history has proven, and it's over and over, that that's not the way democracies go. That's not the way countries make transition from dictatorship to democracy. Over the last 30-some years, we have done everything we could to cripple the Islamic Republic and force it supposedly into a democratic, human rights kind of a system. Nothing has changed. And at the same time, we made every effort to keep Mr. Mubarak in place and made trade with it and all kinds of stuff. And Mr. Mubarak is now in a cage. All right. So I think, as I've said over and over, diplomacy and sanctions fatten dictators. Trade and diplomacy creates democracy and destroys them. Now, another issue is Iran's power. Underlying U.S. assumption on policy side is that a strong Iran is a dangerous Iran for the region. This came from the British time. Back in the middle of the 19th century, was sold to the Americans and then to the even United Nations Security Council. That a strong Iran is a dangerous Iran, and a better Iran for the region is a weaker Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, again, history proves it wrong. Let me just give you one latest example. If Saddam Hussein, if there was no revolution in Iran, the Islamic revolution, and the regime had not become weaker, Saddam Hussein would have not invaded Iran. If Saddam had not invaded Iran and would have not become bankrupt, it would have not invaded Kuwait. And if Iraq had not invaded Kuwait, we would have not been in the mess we are with Iraq and the region. The very fact that Iran got weakened after the revolution created all the mess that followed afterwards. Again, we can discuss this, and I know some of you may disagree, but allow me to just express my own personal views. Now, for example, there is another issue about problems between US and Iran. There are 4 problems that we often put on the table for Iran: the nuclear issue, the terrorism issue, the peace between Arabs and Israelis, and now, of course, Palestinian and Israelis. There is no Arab-Israeli conflict anymore. And finally is the issue of human rights and democracy. Yes, these issues are important issues, but, my friends, these are not bilateral issues. These are global and regional issues. Human rights, democracy, terrorism, peace, nuclear issues, these are all problems of our time and has nothing to do with just bilateral matters. And of course, related to this issue is a third-party problem. I believed and have continued to believe that because these issues are global and regional, the third parties' concerns have also been always incorporated in any strategic thinking in US-Iran relations, like being Arabs or the Palestinians or Israelis in that matter. All of them are legitimate. They have legitimate complaints, concerns, and demands. On Iran's strategic and economic significance and others, I could just point a few things. Many of us still think that Iran is an oil economy. Iran has an oil economy. It does not. Only 20% of Iran's GNP comes from oil. Iran used to be very dependent on oil income, but it is not anymore. Many of us think that sanctions brought the Islamic Republic to the table. Ladies and gentlemen, it did not. What brought the Islamic Republic to the table was the fear that it will be getting into a war with the United States. The Islamic Republic's policy for a long time from the beginning has been very simple: to maintain no war, no peace with the United States of America. The Islamic Republic has, at the level of particularly regime, it has never wanted peace with the U.S., and it never had wanted war with the U.S. It's funny that the U.S. policy has also contributed to that status quo. In this country, we clearly have always avoided war with Iran, okay? But at the same time, we could not make peace because there were third parties who were against it. So on both sides, they have settled with no war, no peace. At any time the war side of the trouble increases, grows, the Islamic Republic comes to the center, as it did during the last 6 months. But I tell you, the minute the war side decreases, the problem with the war side decreases and the prospect for peace increases, unless we think strategically about it, about the regime, is going to have to walk away. Because from the day one, the Islamic Republic has assumed that the United States of America will not live with this revolution, that this revolution one day or one day it will be destroyed by the United States. So it's always maintains that situation of no war, no peace. And I wanted to also say just finally a few words, just a few very quick words on I think what the problem with the strategic thinking in the U.S. is also that we really have no idea of what kind of Iran we want. An Iran that does not have bomb, but is a friend, a strategic friend of Russia and China, is that acceptable to the United States of America? An Iran that has no bomb, but really goes all the way to China and Russia and cuts off from the U.S., is that what the United States of America wants? We haven't really thought about that before. An Iran that maintains, the system as is, the theocracy, but have, no bomb and has no other stuff, well, that would be acceptable. These are the kind of things we really have to think about, the kind of Iran we need to build. Finally, a few words about AIC and this group. First, I am very honored to say that since the establishment of the AIC almost a quarter century ago, we have always remained strategic in our thinking, and we have remained consistent and persistent with our activities and ideas, and passionately so. We never wavered. We never supported sanctions of any kind. They call it smart sanctions, targeted sanctions, and all kinds of other sanctions. We never supported any of them. We don't think that's strategic. We never wavered on diplomacy, sometimes calling to stop it and others to move for it. We did not take an opportunistic perspective on that. We stayed in the field even if the field was extremely stormy and did not leave the scene. I'm very honored to say that because we thought and always think that we are right in the way we think about U.S.-Iran relations. After all, ladies and gentlemen, the common interests of the two countries far outweigh their differences. We have to realize that, and when you realize that, then there is no fear in staying the course and making sure that the two great nations will come together one day soon, and I'm sure it will come to that point one day. And finally, strategic thinking will have to start with us here, that we need to be first ourselves a strategic thinker before we can instill that kind of thinking in the administration in this country or in the U.S. Iranian government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Amir Ahmadi. I think his last words are extremely important. The common interests of the United States and Iran far outweigh their differences. The question is, how can we demonstrate that? And ladies and gentlemen, as you know, our session today was intended as a participatory session. These lead discussants, except for the first two, are not really intended as lectures because we really want everybody around the table to share with us their experience, their perspective in trying to build bridges between these two countries. And that's why, for the remaining lead discussants, I really would like to ask them to keep their remarks to 5, at the very, very most 7 minutes. When I raise a piece of paper, it means you only have 2 minutes left. So I would really beseech you to stick to that if you can. The next speaker is Bob Einhorn, a man who has played an historic role in establishing and opening a diplomatic channel to Iran last March of 2013, which is likely to go down as an historic development in international relations. He is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, one of the brightest strategic minds in international security in Washington. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Einhorn. Go ahead, sir.
I'd like to thank the AIC for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction. But I don't thank you for changing the rules in the middle of the game in terms of, but I'll be as brief as I can be and still do what you asked me to do. And what I'd like to do is two things. One is tell you where I think the nuclear negotiations stand, what the prospects are, but also say a few words about prospects for improved U.S.-Iranian bilateral relations. My sense is I was involved directly in these negotiations for about 5 years. I left the negotiations last summer, 2 weeks before President Rouhani was elected. Maybe my timing wasn't so great. If his election had been 2 weeks earlier, maybe I would now be still involved in the negotiations. But by the time I left, things weren't going terribly well. They only picked up afterwards. At this moment, and after the November agreement was concluded, talks have gone forward in a very determined way. I think both sides are quite intent on trying to reach a deal. Every indication is that both sides want to reach a deal, and to do so by July 20th, which is when this current interim agreement expires. They're supposed to begin drafting a deal when the so-called P5+1 talks with Iran resume on May 13th, but it's going to be a tall order for them to conclude by July 20th. The main difference is that Iran wants to preserve and even expand its current civil nuclear capacity. The United States believes strongly that there needs to be a very significant reduction in that nuclear infrastructure, and the main U.S. motive is to lengthen the so-called breakout period. The breakout period would be from the time that Iran, at some future time, would decide to abandon the constraints and go pursue nuclear weapons. How long would it take Iran to produce enough highly enriched uranium or plutonium actually to have enough nuclear material for a single bomb? That's the breakout period. The U.S. believes that if you reduce the current nuclear capacity of Iran, you can lengthen that breakout period and reduce the likelihood that there would ever be a breakout for the constraints. The biggest gap is on the question of uranium enrichment. You all may know Iran has a significant capacity, 19,000 installed centrifuges. The U.S. would like to reduce that number very, very significantly, maybe to a few thousand of them. The head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Ali Salehi, just said on the 13th, just yesterday, that he believes Iran needs to, in the near term, have 30,000 centrifuges, enough to produce fuel for the Bushehr nuclear power reactor that Iran has imported from Russia. He says that instead of the first generation of centrifuge machine, Iran would like to produce a more powerful machine, 25 times more powerful than the current generation. And he believes that Iran should have the capacity not just to fuel the Bushehr reactor, but 5 or 6 reactors. And that would take about 50,000 of these very powerful centrifuges. This is what the scope of nuclear program he's talking about is hundreds of times greater than what the United States would consider acceptable to limit the so-called breakout period. We're simply not in the same ballpark yet. You need to understand that. We are not in the same ballpark in reaching agreement. Now, if there is to be an agreement, I think it's essential that Iran become realistic about its actual uranium production needs, the actual needs of producing enriched uranium for a peaceful nuclear program in Iran. Reality is that Iran's actual needs to have enriched uranium are very small. Iran has imported a reactor from Russia, a power reactor, and there's a deal between Iran and Russia that Russia will provide fuel for 10 years. And Iran is saying we need to, because the Russians are unreliable as suppliers, we need to be able to take over fuel supply and produce fuel for our reactor after 10 years. The Russians take great offense at this accusation of unreliability and said, we're more than happy to produce fuel for the life of this reactor. Iran wants to purchase 2 or 3 additional reactors from Russia. Russia is saying, we'll provide, I'm sorry, I'm going to take a little while. Russia is saying, we are happy to provide fuel for the life of those reactors as well. The reality is Iran cannot produce, for the next 20, 30 years, Iran will not be able to produce enriched uranium as efficiently or cheaply as Russia. That's the reality. But Iran still says it wants to produce its own fuel. There's a solution here. The solution is if Iran says we will produce fuel for 2 research reactors to produce medical isotopes for the diagnosis and treatment of cancers, we will take that on, but we're going to import fuel from Russia for the power reactors that are going to generate electricity for the Iranian people. That's the solution, because the fuel for research reactors is a very small amount. And that would be compatible with what the U.S. and its P5+1 partners say are necessary to limit the breakout capacity. So there's a solution, but it requires Iran to be much more realistic about its actual fuel needs. There are other issues. You may have heard the Arak reactor, which I believe was intended by Iran to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. The U.S. And its partners want that reactor to be redesigned to reduce its plutonium production potential. Already, the Iranians have indicated that they're prepared to redesign the reactor. I think a compromise is possible on that. I think a compromise is also possible on verification. Iran has said it's prepared to be transparent. It has nothing to hide. If that's the case, that's great, because what will be required to produce confidence in any agreement are some very intrusive monitoring arrangements. So I hope they can find a deal, find agreement on that. That you have read about the underground Fordo enrichment plant, deep buried under a mountain to protect it. The U.S. Doesn't believe that this is necessary. It only has about a capacity of 3,000 centrifuges. The Natanz enrichment facility has a capacity of 50,000. It's hard to imagine that this Fordo facility adds anything to a civil nuclear program. The American concern was that it was designed as a covert program. So the U.S. wants to get rid of that facility altogether. Iran doesn't want to get rid of it. I think the solution is to turn it into a nuclear research and development facility where Iran could do research on advanced centrifuges so that someday it can produce centrifuges and enriched uranium as efficiently as the Russians and fuel their own reactors, but not today. Today, it only gives grounds for concern. Anyway, just to sum up this portion of my remarks, I say the differences today are very great. The difference in particular on this capacity of Iran's enrichment program, that gap will have to be bridged by a realistic Iranian decision to only meet the practical needs of its civil program. Can this be done by July 20th? I think it's a very tall order to do this by July 20th. The details of a verification arrangement are going to be very extensive, and it's going to be very hard to finish. Neither side wants to admit at this time that it won't conclude by July 20th. Why? Because the opponents of the Obama administration and the opponents of the Rouhani administration both claim to believe that the deal is in the interest of the other side. The other side wants to extend this forever because it's in their interest. So the critics' administration shouldn't agree to extend. And it's amazing. There's a kind of mirror image situation between the critics on both the American and the Iranian sides. I agree with the comment before. I think the agreement is advantageous to the United States and its P5+1 partners. But the critics in the Middle East, as well as in the U.S. Congress, don't agree with that. And they say you better get a deal by July 20th, otherwise draconian new sanctions are going to be voted. I think that would be a big mistake, but that's one reason why the U.S. administration is not even admitting the possibility of an extended agreement. I think there will be an extension. There has to be an extension. There's just too much detail that has to be resolved. But an extension won't be easy. Why? Because the Obama critics are saying if you get an extension, it's got to achieve a real major rollback in the Iranian program, not just a freeze. Rouhani's critics are saying if you do an extension, We can't just have modest sanctions relief. You have to roll back these sanctions in a modest way. So an extended agreement could be just as tough to conclude as a comprehensive agreement. So sometime in July, some very hard decisions will have to be taken. If you ask me what the prospects are for a nuclear deal, the president says 50-50. I think that's about right. Maybe even less than that. It is so the gaps are so wide now. But we will see. Let me just say a word about this broader issue, the prospects for U.S.-Iranian relations. Many would like to see a nuclear deal result in a dramatic improvement in U.S.-Iranian bilateral relations. I'm one of those. I would like to see this nuclear deal lead to a wider rapprochement between the two countries. But I appeal to you, you have to be realistic about the prospects for that. At the moment, neither side is prepared to broaden the agenda. Each side, it has the same talking points. We need to focus on the nuclear deal. That's job number one. We need to do the nuclear deal. Let's not broaden the discussions. I was involved in all discussions that were held when I was in government, including some rather private ones. And I can tell you, that's all that was discussed, the nuclear deal. Neither side has authority to go beyond the nuclear deal. It's felt we got to do that first, and let's see what happens after that. If there is no nuclear deal, if it just proves too difficult, if the minimum requirements of each side just doesn't overlap with the minimum requirements of the other side and there is no deal, then I think prospects for improving U.S.-Iranian relations are going to be very minimal, very, very limited for any improvement in relations. Why? Because if there's no deal, there's going to be tremendous pressure, especially on President Obama, to ratchet up the sanctions. The U.S. Congress was convinced by the Obama administration to pull back from a vote on draconian new sanctions. I think that was a wise move. But if there is a new deal, if negotiations fail, there will be tremendous pressure immediately to pass legislation with draconian new sanctions. And that's going to be a real problem for U.S.-Iranian relations. But even if there's an agreement, you have to be realistic about where it will lead. If there's an agreement, an improvement of relations will be gradual at the very best. Why? Because, and I think that's unfortunate. I think there are common interests. Afghanistan is an area where the interests of both sides clearly overlap, and there are many other areas where U.S.-Iranian relations overlap. But there is a wide perception in in the United States about Iran's intentions. First of all, its intentions in the nuclear area. There are many in Washington who believe even if there's a nuclear deal, it's only going to be a temporary deal. Iran is biding its time until it has an opportunity to break out and go from there. There's a wide suspicion. Whether or not that's accurate, that's a suspicion. There's also great concern about Iran's regional behavior. Its support for Bashar al-Assad, support for Hezbollah, shipment of arms to Hamas, efforts with the Yemeni, undermining the Yemeni regime, Bahrain, and so forth. You go on and on and on. There's grave concern about that. And even if there's an agreement, there'll be an effort by the Obama administration to show the U.S. Congress, the U.S. people, and its partners in the Middle East that the U.S. will continue to counter what it regards as Iranian troublesome behavior in the region. So what I'm saying is I think all in this room would like to see an improvement in U.S.-Iranian relations. I think one has to be very realistic about it. Without an agreement, no prospect of improvement. With an agreement, prospects will improve, but any improvement will be quite gradual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Einhorn. Before I turn to Professor Shireen Hunter, a leading geopolitical thinker, I'd just say in reply to Mr. Einhorn that he drew a very interesting equivalence between the US and Iran. However, only one of those countries is the world's leader. Only one of those two countries, the United States, has global responsibilities. So I think it takes two to tango is very, very important. It's a very critical part of the story. At the same time, I think the key issue on the table is, are we going to see American leadership? With those remarks, Professor Hunter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have been called an Iran expert, but a global geopolitical thinker. Thank you. Although I must say I have, in the course of 40 years, I have learned a lot. Frankly, after the speakers, there's not really much left for me to say, but I will try my best to bring in a couple of things. As a way of intro, I would say that it's not just that U.S.-Iran relations require strategic thinking, but the whole gamut of America's foreign policy requires strategic thinking. I think that one of the problems of the United States that I have in the course of, I did my master's degree on American foreign policy at London School of Economics, so I have been dealing with this, almost like 50 years, so it's not, I'm not exactly a newcomer to the field. But one of the problems of America is that actually strategic thinking doesn't exist in America in the real thing. When we talk about strategic issues, generally it is considered military issues, and that is a problem. America's approach to foreign policy is like that. I have the Iran dossier, I have the Afghan dossier, I have Saudi dossier, I have Arab-Israeli dossier, Russian dossier. Very little we have seen, first, people who actually can navigate these different issues, and that is, specialists of a bureau and so on and so forth, but also even in academia, excessive specialization that we don't have actually the kind of, 19th century, early 20th century strategic thinking, or as Henry Kissinger, probably the last of American strategic thinkers, called, how to mix apples and oranges and to see how apples and oranges relate together. So I'm going to begin to say that it is time that America begins to actually evaluate and reassess some of the assumptions of its foreign policy, including, for example, who are America's friends and who are not America's friends. To be honest with you, I find it very difficult to find Saudi Arabia an American friend. Most of the problems that we have, I think that whether it is Daesh or whether it is Taliban, whether it is so on and so forth, is really part and parcel of the Wahhabi. We don't call it Wahhabi anymore because we don't want to upset the Saudis. So many times we don't want to upset the Saudis and we get involved in that. It's really time to see what it is. How many Americans actually have suffered, let's say that as a result of Saudi activities? Even Pakistan. I mean, if everybody says that, Pakistan played a double game in Afghanistan, we give the money to them and they support the Taliban and they kill our boys and we have drones. And so I'm just trying to say this, that we do need to, for example, assess this. The other thing is that we have to be very honest about what is at the root of the problem with Iran. I have always been of the opinion that the nuclear problem with Iran is actually the symptom of the problems, the fundamental problems that exist in U.S.-Iran relations rather than the cause of it. Because if only it was that acquisition of nuclear knowledge or the acquisition of nuclear even weapons was the cause of this, we should have been worried about Pakistan a long time ago. And I really think we should have. Even now we have to be more worried about Pakistan than we are. So I think that we have to be honest to see what is at the core of American problem with Iran. And I'm glad that Hushang said this before, that the British had the idea that, a weak Iran is better Iran. But again, I don't want to visit a very sore subject, but the whole handling of the Shah and so on and so forth partly was because, and I'm not known for my discretion in my talks, I would have been better off if I had. But the fact was that one of the problems of the US and everybody else with the Shah was that they kept saying that he has got too big for his britches. It wasn't that he was the most. In fact, now, even in terms of political prisoners and whatever, Turkish generals had much worse record than the Shah ever had, or Marcus or General Gattieri, and a whole gallery of things. So I think that this is something we also have to see, that, as Lord Curzon said, Persia and the Persian question, how to deal with this landmass which sits between the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea on the so-called oil route. And so I think these are some of the things that really we need to do. The other thing that we really have to be revisit is that, the use we have made of Iran in the post-Soviet era, and for a whole bunch of things. I think that, dual containment and the creation of Taliban, and I have written about this for at least since 1989. I have been writing about this stuff, and it's nothing, a hindsight. And so that is one of the problems. The issue is, can America do without an Iranian threat, or America's regional allies can do without an Iranian threat? I think that is one of the things. The question of sanction has not been merely to, force Iran to the negotiating table. It has been basically to sap the energy of Iran as the only viable potential power in West Asia. I don't know whether this is correct or not, but again, I quote Kissinger. Somebody told me Kissinger, when things had changed, but the Shah had become a bit too obnoxious, said that we don't want another Japan in Western Asia. So I think we have to be honest about all these things. But having gone from that, is that we have really to see, has there been, or as Hushang said, have our policies actually helped us, the policies vis-a-vis Iran have helped us or not, including, for example, immediately after the invasion of Afghanistan, when Iran was very worried and wanted to cooperate with us. Even immediately after the invasion of Iraq, where the Iranians actually were cooperative. And so I think we have to do that. For instance, has it served us to basically encourage Wahhabi Islam as a way of a countervailing influence for the Iranian revolutionary thing? This is essentially has been done. And that is what it is. We are seeing, and I have seen even some regional countries are, I believe, somewhat naively thinking that Al-Qaeda is better than Hezbollah or whatever. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, neither of them get my approval. So, but this is a problem we have had. The other thing is, for example, I just wrote something recently. For instance, our so-called pipeline policies. I mean, if you are seeing the plight of Ukraine today, where Russia switches on and off the gas line, in part is because we have worked incredibly hard to keep Iranian gas from the markets. We, for example, preferred that Turkey have the blue stream, basically becoming dependent on Russia. They get now 60% of gas from Russia, rather than allowing Iran, for example, to have gas pipelines through Turkey, which to go, for example, even places like Bulgaria and so on and so forth. So I think that all these things are kind of interrelated. Our focus on anti-Iran focus, has it helped actually stability in the Caucasus? No, not the opposite. Creating problems between Azerbaijan and Iran has not benefited, anybody. And, Nagorno-Karabakh is and it has pushed them more towards Russia. Armanistan has become basically, again, dependent on Russia, partly because we don't allow them to get, again, oil and gas and other things. Now, Russians have been playing bad as well. So I think these are some of the things that we need. The other thing is that one thing we have to understand, the first lesson I learned, I think a professor I had again at LSE told me, foreign policy is about a dialogue between the internal and the external. In other words, of course, Iranians have to realize this as well. All politics are local. So to bemoan that Congress is opposing certain things for Iran, or that to bemoan that there is politics in Iran, they are hardliners and so on, it's really just denying that sun rises and sets. So the question is, how do you, I will do that at my good time, and it's not going to be very long. So I think that this is something that we have to understand. We have missed so many opportunities in terms of interacting with Iran. We have made too often, and I remember saying this in '93, the first meeting Hussein started, we have made so many things, preconditions that Iran has to meet before we can start, that the result has been that the radicals have won. For example, isolating Iran has made it more difficult for the pragmatists to win. You see, they have to show that their pragmatic policy has some benefits. We basically did not help Khatami. We did not help Rafsanjani. Whereas if we had helped them, some of the issues now we are upset about probably would have been resolved. For example, Iranian support for Hezbollah, that we think that absolutely I disagree. As far as I'm concerned, Iran just should leave Middle East and forget about it. But if we had dealt with them, these relationships have been changed. But we wanted them to do it first, something that they couldn't do given their political environments. My last point is about so-called Iran's regional behavior. And here I have to say that, frankly, comparing Iran's behavior in Bahrain with what Saudi Arabia did there, and what is happening in a kind of ethnic cleansing in Bahrain. Pakistan is actually, now everybody knows Pakistani soldiers were involved in torturing the Bahrainis. And as far as Yemen and Saudi Arabia is concerned, all you have to do is to read the history of Saudi Arabia's relation with Yemen, which has been one of territorial gain, Najran, Asir, and so on. So let me just try to bring this to conclusion. First, we have to be honest about what is our problem with Iran. That is really what we see. Is Iran the rebellious satrapy that has to be punished? Which, it's a legitimate argument. People can do that. The other thing is that is really Iran, we have to be honest, is Iran at the source of all these problems? This third thing is that our allies, today's allies, are really our allies, certainly in the Persian Gulf, Arab states, which all of them are not anti-Iran. If you look at Kuwait or even Oman and now Qatar, maybe even changing. And the other thing is that, last point is, since the end of the Cold War, we started on a policy of thinking that we can contain everybody and not to pay a lesson for that. For example, in the Middle East and Central Asia, we had not a dual containment policy. We had a quadruple containment policy to contain Russia, to contain Iran, to contain China, so on and so forth. Now, some of these things you cannot do. Some of these things, for example, in the Caucasus and so on, to leave it Iran out of the equation plays into the Russian hand. So let me finish. Thank you for your patience. Let me finish. I think that as an old student, both in age and also in time I have spent on it, that the United States foreign policy is really due for an overhaul and strategic thinking, that how some of these things actually link to one another. And as long as we don't do that, and I didn't have time to get into the China angle, with the problems in Russia, Iran's bargaining position is going to increase. And, a lot of the Cold War dynamics is going to come to play. So thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to our discussion.
That was a model presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hunter. We're now going to go to Ambassador John Limbert, a statesman and a scholar par excellence, fluent speaker of Persian, who, as you know, retired from the United States Foreign Service with the rank of ambassador and is now a professor at the U.S. Naval College in Annapolis, Maryland. After Ambassador Limbert, we are going to go to the next room, serve ourselves our lunch. We're going to bring it back to the table. And then after that, we're going to go to Mr. Crowland, who's going to get us into some of the nitty-gritty of the sanctions. We have Mr. Farhad Alavi here, who was quoted in today's New York Times in that substantive piece that was in the New York Times today about can Iran actually get relief if plays ball on the nuclear front. There is some skepticism expressed in that piece in which Farhad is quoted extensively today. And after Mr. Crowland, we're going to go to Mr. Piruz Parvarande for some final brief remarks on what we can all accomplish through teamwork and so on. And then we are going to have our discussion. And we're going to really get into what everybody thinks can be done that's useful. How can we find a solution to this very vexing problem? So with those remarks, Ambassador Limbert.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Ali Dad, I think I get the hint that I'm standing between you and lunch. So I think I better be brief. Look, thank you. First of all, thanks to Hushang and Senator Bennett and AIC, and thanks to all of you here, many of whom I'm honored to know and to be friends with. And thank you for the good work that you've done, the work you've done in this very good cause over a long period of time. I know from personal experience, it doesn't always earn you thanks. I have been called, when I went back to the State Department a few years ago, I was called the Manchurian Candidate. One of my favorite movies, by the way, but it was not meant as a compliment. Some of my Persian-speaking friends have used a more harsh language, usually calling me something that ends with the suffix kesh. You know what that is. I won't go into more detail about that. But this relationship, whether you look at it as a glass half full or glass half empty, I'm going to talk about the symbols, because it's the symbols, I think, that matter a great deal and that often determine whether we make any progress or don't. But whatever you say, one thing you can't deny, that today we are in a different place and a better place than we've been for a very long time. I mean, just on a very simple level, Hassan is talking to Hossein. And that's different. That's the first time in history that that's happened. The two foreign ministers are talking, and they describe their conversations as positive and productive. Think about it. When was the last time those two words were used in anything involving Iran and the United States? The last time the two foreign ministers met was 1979, when Yazdi and Vance met, and however you describe that meeting, it was neither positive nor productive. Now, the problem is, for us now, how do we avoid the kind of missteps that are going to take us away from this better place? Well, we can't avoid them completely. They're always going to be there. So the issue is not so much avoiding them, but how do you keep them from destroying the whole process, taking us back to the edge, to the world of Bash, that world that we were in for 34 years, taking us back to that abyss that we stood on for 34 years. Well, first of all, we have to understand the power of symbols on both sides. When the interim deal was negotiated. People here and some of our allies said, "Oh, this is Munich. This is worse than Munich," evoking a very powerful symbol of surrender and sellout and appeasement. In Iran, something similar went on, and people said, "This is Turkmenchai." Turkmenchai all over again. How many people in this town know what Turkmenchai is? My students do, but probably not many beyond that. How many people at the State Department know what Turkmenchai was? 1828 1828. That was even before Franklin Pierce was president over there. But those are powerful symbols. Those are powerful symbols. And whether these are accurate metaphors or not, they have power. And we have to recognize their power. We ignore their power at our own peril. Because the enemy in all of this process, I think, is a lack of empathy, what you might call obliviousness to how the other side perceives the world and perceives what we do and what we say. And I must say, neither side has a monopoly on obliviousness. We've seen it recently from the Iranian side in this very bizarre appointment of their new UN ambassador. But we saw it back in 1973 on the American side, when 20 years after the CIA coup that toppled Mossadegh, who do we appoint as ambassador to Iran but the former head of the CIA? You have to ask. It's something that comes up in politics, and maybe Senator Bennett knows this better than I do, but you often ask this question, what were they thinking? Or even, were they thinking when they did something like this? Okay, how do we change? How do we change this? Well, the model that intrigues me is, maybe some of you are aware of this, what I call the Mississippi Delta model. I don't know, some of you may be aware of this project down in the Mississippi Delta. One of the poorest areas of our own country, last in just about every index of health and well-being. And they went out and they discovered an Iranian model for improving health conditions down there. Something called, the Iranians call it Khane Behvar, so the rural health houses. And you know, in the Mississippi Delta, everything has been tried, nothing has worked. And so what they did was they found this model. They went to the Iranian government, and this was not at a good time in our relations. They went to the Ministry of Health. They went to the University of Shiraz, where this was going on, and they said, "We need your help. We can learn from you." And while relations were absolutely at a rock bottom, what did the Iranians do? I'm sure it would come no surprise in this room. They said, of course we can help. And the project goes on. And people from here from Mississippi go to Iran. People from Iran come to Mississippi. And both sides seem quite pleased with the way this is going. But what this did, of course, was to reverse the usual model, the model that people were accustomed to, where one side becomes the donator, if you like, and the other side always the receiver. So, as our Mississippi friends told me, when they were in Iran, they were traveling out somewhere near Marvdash. They stopped in a tea house to rest, and one of the local people turned to one of the Iranian doctors and said, "What are these Americans doing here? I thought we got rid of them." And the answer was, they're here to learn from us. They're here to get help from us. And the response was, "Oh, that's different. That's different." And then one of the comments was, I never knew that rain could fall up because they had reversed the pattern. And think of the symbolic power of that. Now, problem is, and this defeats me, but maybe some of us have ideas, is how do you transfer that model, that way of thinking, that way of operating into the political sphere? I don't know how to do it, but I think we're going to need to do it if we're going to move beyond the negative power of the symbols of Munich and Turkmenchai. Thank you very much. I know it's time for lunch.